Hi, we're Oxygen Conservation, and this is the Shoot Room Sessions. Well, welcome to the Shoot Room.
It's great to be here, Rich.
Can you tell people who you are and what you do?
Yes, I'm Matt Walpole, and I am the Chief Executive of the Cornwall Wildlife Trust.
That has to be like one of the best jobs in the environment sector, right?
It's the best one I've done, and I've done some crazy things, and without a doubt, it is.
That sets us up perfectly for some of those crazy things. So can you give us your career contents page? So the book that is you, what are the chapters that took you from where you grew up to being here today?
So I grew up in Cornwall, but I wasn't born there. So that's probably your first scoop. People think I'm Cornish. I grew up in Cornwall, but
With the socks.
the socks.
Yeah.
But I was born in Lincolnshire.
We haven't talked about
No,
that.
we haven't talked about that. Okay. Yeah. Did your dad fly nuclear bombs?
No.
Chance now. So grew up in an RAF family. So we moved around a little bit when I was very, very young. Don't remember so much about that. Eventually settled in Cornwall, which is where I grew up, and then headed off to college, got interested in ecology, natural sciences. But what I really wanted to do was go to Africa, bang around in a Land Rover, chasing large animals around.
What was the genesis of that? Do you know why? Can you place what was the first thing that planted that seed?
I think there was something about travel and distant places, which maybe that came from sort of my father being away a lot when I was a child and traveling a lot. But I think there was something so I got the bug for that. And growing up in Cornwall, of course, it's wild. You spend your whole time out on the beach, on the moors, and then doing things like 10 tours and coming up to Dartmoor, and it being like, wow, this is crazy. And I think I graduated from there. When I was at college, a bunch of us were sitting around in the bar one day, and the conversation turned to sort of travel and stuff. And somebody said, hey, why don't we go to Borneo? Why don't we do an expedition to Borneo? You're 19, 20. We said, yeah, let's do that. And that was the start of it in many ways. So as a student, getting together, making a plan, getting the funding together, and then spending a couple of months right in the heart of Borneo. And we were there doing insect surveys and things, looking at how shifting cultivation was affecting insect communities. But it was still pretty pristine rainforest back then. And that was intense, as you can imagine. Couple that with a couple of weeks in Bali learning to dive, and you've kind of got the perfect trip. And so at that point, you think, okay, do I want to go back into a lab? I'm a biologist. Do I want to go and do a PhD? Where else is there in the world? So then you start to go through your stack of National Geographic magazines. You spot all the really cool places, all the cool people. I wrote to everybody I could think of. A naive youngster going, hey, I've got a degree in natural sciences. I want to come and do something. Most people were very polite when they wrote back. But in the end, I did get myself to Southern Africa on a trip to go and visit some of those folk and look at what was happening in conservation and figure out what I could do. And that led me to a PhD in Kent in the Durrell Institute. I didn't when I left college. I thought I don't think I want to do a PhD. I think I want to go and do something real.
Did you know what a PhD was at that point?
I did. Yes, I knew it was going to be like 3 years of hard.
Because I kind of started mine not really knowing what I was doing.
Right.
I kind of started mine just to play sport because they were like, well, if you do this, you can stay at uni another 3 years. And I was like, wanted to play sport. I had a girlfriend there at the time. I thought, I don't want a job. Because my version of a job, my dad was a builder. My mum was a dinner lady in a clinic. They both had great work ethics, but work to me meant manual labor, things that were physically unpleasant. And I was like, I could put that off 3 years. Let's just not do that.
Yeah.
So I had no idea.
So as a kid, at school, so many of my friends and college friends knew they wanted to be a medic, or a lawyer, or did their degree and then went into the city because, you did. And similarly, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but the idea of a job just sounded way too grown up, to be honest. And part of going off and traveling, going to Africa was just this sense of, I want to go on safari. That's what I want to do. I managed, bizarrely, to end up doing a PhD basically about going on safari. So my PhD was all about nature-based tourism and looking at how that contributes to wildlife conservation, positively and negatively. So having sort of gone to East Africa, met a bunch of people, everybody said, great, but go home and find some funding and then come back and talk to us. And various people have mentioned the Durrell Institute in Canterbury. So I called them up and said, hey, what have you got going on? Is they did a master's course, they're not going to go in the course. And they said, come in tomorrow. We'd like to interview you for a PhD place. We've got this program. Well, I mean, it was perfect timing, real luck. Most of my career has been based on luck.
Well, yes, but also writing the letters, putting one foot in front of the other, picking up the phone. Yeah. So I talk about luck a lot and being incredibly fortunate to be doing what we're doing. But I also think there's something about hard work increases the surface area of luck. So if you didn't pick up the phone, that wasn't a thing. No. So you do have to create your own luck as well.
You're absolutely right. And that was a really interesting thing, because the professors at university had got a big chunk of money from the government to look at this, the kind of the full suite of issues around nature-based tourism. So it was very much a multidisciplinary thing. And, PhDs, and certainly back then at least, were always meant to be deep and narrow, and you become the expert in the tiniest little thing. And this was actually looking at not just the ecology around it, but the ecological, social, economic impacts of tourism. And this question of, what does sustainable tourism look like? What is ecotourism? Does it really exist? And they had a bunch of case studies around the world. And in the end, one that I focused on was Komodo National Park. So back in Indonesia, but a bit further east from Bali. And when that sort of happened, I thought, wow, this is great. I'm going to go off to Indonesia again, do this. It was quite unsettling, because it was this mix of things. I had to, as an ecologist, very sort of quickly get to grips with economics and statistics and social science, questionnaire methodologies. We had a cross-disciplinary team, so there was support there. But I really felt like I was sort of flying completely blind and thinking, is this really going to be a PhD? Is this going to happen? This was back in the sort of mid-90s. And it did. And in many ways, then, that we've seen an explosion of that kind of thing since, because conservation went from being something that was about the science of small and declining populations into something that was much closer to geography, which is what I really enjoyed at school. But I was told I couldn't do at A-level, because no, you have to do 3 sciences or 3 sciences of maths, and geography is spread by rugby players. So, but I found my way back to what I found I really loved.
When you look back now, what was the key sentiment pit about making sure that nature tourism or ecotourism can be a positive force and be regenerative or successful? What does it need to do to be a force for good?
So the whole thing with tourism is about that interplay between the destination, the hosts, and the guests, and it's about getting that balance right. So you think about a place like Komodo National Park. You've got a national park there. You've got wildlife. You've got a team of rangers and a budget that needs to be met. You've got villages on the islands. You've got people who are trying to subsist, often in real deep poverty, and then you've got this industry coming in, which like any industry, any business can really change things. And so the questions we were kind of asking was, okay, can tourism contribute economically to the park in terms of income and revenue generation? Can it do that without killing the golden goose? Because now, again, we see so many more of these examples of over-tourism, of unregulated tourism, where just too much pressure, the wrong kind of pressure, ends up damaging the very thing you're trying to conserve. And then on top of that, if you've got local communities who, in many cases, have had their livelihoods negatively affected by the designation of parks, potentially, or have very few other options, how do you balance that? You're bringing in potentially enormous amounts of wealth, new income streams. How do you tie that with local traditions, local livelihoods? How do you give people opportunities out of that? And how do you ultimately avoid conflict? Because that's one of the key things, with conservation, particularly where you are, for whatever set of reasons, setting aside land or being more restrictive on what can be done. How do you balance that with local economies and societies in ways that are inclusive, equitable, fair, I suppose, but also that avoid those challenges where, ultimately people are going to come in and burn the house down because all they see is a problem and no benefit whatsoever. So it's fascinating.
And incredibly complicated.
Yeah.
Okay, so take us on from a PhD.
So doing that, what I suppose where it took me was this a whole set of questions around how do you balance nature and society? How do you balance conservation and other forms of land use or economy? And as I was finishing my PhD, interesting enough, one of the other sites was in Southern Africa, and it was it was private conservancies where they were basically bringing black rhinos back after horrendous declines because of poaching. And I really wanted to do something with rhinos. Don't ask me why, but I did. And as I was finishing up my PhD, a professor came to DICE, to the Darwin Institute, who was a big rhino guy, and he managed to get some funding for a project in the Masai Mara, working with WWF, all about human-wildlife conflicts. So broader than tourism, but asking that set of questions. If you've got a big place like the Mara, and it's unfenced, so it's porous borders there, and it's on an international boundary as well. You've got large mammals, you've got this huge influx of tourism, but you've got communities all around. You've got critically endangered species like black rhinos. How do you balance those things? How do you solve the conflicts and create forms of coexistence? So part of that was about what's tourism doing, good and bad. Part of it was about how are people living with large animals. So you imagine if your livestock is as pastoralists, as a Maasai, you've got cattle, goats, sheep, and you're living with lions and leopards all around you. What happens if you're trying to grow maize and you've got elephants around you? And that was the thing that we focused quite heavily on, was how do you solve problems of elephants coming out of the park, coming out of forest blocks and trashing people's maize crops and their farms, which then causes people to go out there and spear the elephants, because why wouldn't you in that kind of a situation? So we played around with all sorts of things. What's going to work here? Is electric fencing going to work? Do we need to put up guard towers? Do you need to have firecrackers? I mean, people have tried all sorts of things, and we tried something that a chap in Southern Africa started to use, which was chili oil, because the sense that perhaps elephants might be sensitive to that. You think about their trunk and their nose and if you burn chili, the smoke, it's pretty acrid stuff. Maybe if you coat a fence, it's something that would they'd go, oh, hold on, maybe this is not for me. And we had some good results. We had some good results with that. And what we found in large part was that barriers in general don't work. An elephant will go through, or they'll go round. If you put people out there with noise and light and whatever, then you can deter them, because they're not stupid.
For as long as the people are there.
For as long as people are there. But then here's an interesting thing, and this is a bit we didn't ever publish, and I wish we had. We looked at different patterns of elephant crop raiding, which kind of elephants were doing it when. Obviously, it's all at night. They tend to come out at night. So ordinarily, people are asleep, they come in, whatever. Put watchtowers out there, put searchlights, have people there, bang some drums when they come. Often they'll go, but not always. And what we found was that the family groups and the female-led groups, often, especially if they're young, they would be deterred. But the all male groups, which often are the adolescent males, not so much. And you'd kind of expect that. But then what we also found was there was a real pattern with the cycle of the moon. So if there was a full moon, then those female groups wouldn't come and raid, because they more easily detected, I guess. If there was a new moon and it was dark, they would come and raid. So there was this really interesting lunar pattern. With the males, didn't matter what phase of the moon it was, they were just like, maize. Yeah. Fun stuff.
Sense. Fascinating. Okay, keep taking us forward.
So that was a lot of fun. And I think, some of the best bits of that were working with Kenyan students, with some of the Maasai groups, all of that side of things.
I mean, that's a heck of an experience you're already at the zenith of conservation, doing incredible things in incredible parts of the world. At that point, how do you even think about the next challenge?
This is it. You kind of sitting there going, yeah, this is pretty good. But there were two things, I suppose. One was I knew that I didn't really want to stay in academia, because this is great. It's applied research. It's being used in management. But I wanted to do something where I was really much more on the practical side. And the other is that it's very, very difficult to sustain yourself in the field as a researcher. There are some very, very good examples of people who've built their research stations, and they've continued to be able to raise the funds and do that. But unless you're one of those very, very special people, what tends to happen is you end up stepping back and raising the money for the next group of people to do it, or for the local partners.
People who haven't been in academia don't appreciate that a huge part of it is the constant fundraising cycle. And it is all time bound and very tight. And it's not in the same way that a business can create reserves and a stockpile of things. It's almost like an Olympic cycle for an athlete, but often a year at a time.
Yeah.
And so in that year cycle of research, or perhaps it's a 3-year program, but the funding doesn't always arrive when it's supposed to, and it's never enough as you need. So once you've done 2 of the 3 years, you're raising again, and it's a hard churn for people.
It is, and because I didn't want to take up a lectureship and go down that route, I was trying to raise those funds to continue to do this kind of thing. And so it then becomes you do a little bit of teaching here, you do a bit of consultancy there, you raise a grant. A lot of that grant funding goes into the local situation, local partners, as it should. So I found myself sort of less and less in Kenya and more back in the UK, and starting to apply for jobs in the NGO sector, because that was that was the sort of thing you could do at that point. Stay in academia or go and work for charity.
Yep.
And I got nowhere. I was applying for jobs and getting shortlisted sometimes, getting interviews sometimes. And what always came back was, technically, look at this, great, you've done all these wonderful things, but have you done management? Have you worked in an institutional setting? And I was struggling to convince people that I could do that, because all my experience was still in some ways viewed as, university research, publications, that side of things.
I experienced very similar coming out of my PhD.
Yeah. Anyway,
just on that, I think as a sector, the environment sector and the spreading of that into the finance world through natural capital, I hope, and hopefully we've played a role in this as well, is becoming more open to variety of background and experiences and different skill sets, and being willing to apply experience in other sectors into ours. And it feels a part of that has made it a more collegiate, collaborative space to be in, I think.
I think you're right. I mean, even within the kind of the research space, the academic space at that time, it was increasingly the case that people were looking, beyond ecologists and thinking about how you brought in social science and economics and these kind of things. You move into the NGO sector and you realize how many different kind of skills you need in an organization. And now, of course, there are more and more opportunities in the private sector for that kind of thing. Less so, I think, back then.
Totally.
But still, my mind was still on, a charity, working internationally, doing that kind of thing. And so, again, it comes down, doesn't it, to who you meet and who you know. That slight element of luck. And one thing led to another. I did a bit of consultancy work for Fauna Flora International, which you may know, one of the UK-based international charities based in Cambridge. And that led on to basically 20 years of working in and around Cambridge for conservation organisations.
Wow. High points that stand out when your mind looks over that period? What jumps out?
From this period with the charity.
Yes.
Oh gosh. Some amazing things. Well, I was very, very lucky because I got to spend time working with Fauna Flora in 2 spells, which is very much a practical focused organisation in that they support partners all over the world to do conservation on the ground. So there was a strong sort of resonance to what I'd done, but I was able then to start to work with teams over far greater geographies, so bouncing in and out of all sorts of crazy places was absolutely extraordinary. You can imagine seeing things you wouldn't imagine seeing, species just on the brink or landscapes that, it's really difficult to get into. But on the other side, I spent almost a decade working close to the UN system on all of the intergovernmental international policy side of things, which I never thought I would do. My entire career was based on the fact that I could wear shorts and flip-flops and drive around a Land Rover, and I spent almost 10 years in a suit and tie going around cities and convention centres. And I did that. I got an opportunity to work closely with the UN Environment Programme through another organisation in Cambridge. And I thought, okay, I'll do this for a couple of years and get to understand that policy world. And it kept me there because you start to realise when you can open doors into governments and large institutions, maybe there's a potential to make a difference systemically and at scale, when so much of what we do when you're doing conservation on the ground feels very, very local. So for a whole period of time, I thought if I can use what I do, my experience, and these large kind of data sets and analyses and assessments to try and convince governments and those intergovernmental contexts to think about and do things differently, that maybe that would be a useful way to spend some time. And it was certainly fun for a while, but it got to a point where I realized it wasn't really me.
I was going to ask you which did you feel was the real you, the flip-flops and the shorts or the suit and tie?
I think it's good to be able to do both, I think. And in that, in doing both, you get exposed to such a variety of different kinds of people in different kind of contexts. And I think there's a really good education in that for a start. And you also, I think you learn something about yourself and how you operate in various different contexts. I think I discovered in that I was more of a people person than I thought I was. My kind of game plan, I think, in the outset was to go, as far away from people as possible. Somewhere big and remote, full of elephants or whatever it might be, which I still love, all of that side of things. But I actually found that I get a lot of my energy out of other people. Whether that's teams that you're building, people you're working with, or whether it's partners and that side of things. So I kind of enjoyed going, waving my arms around on different stages. But I think the other thing I discovered was I'm not so good. I can't see myself in large institutions. I find that I like the freedom and the space to be a little bit different, if you like. And the closer I got to some of those large institutions within which you need to operate in a certain way, and you probably had that kind of experience. If you can navigate that, you can achieve great things, and that's great and it's fun. But what's comfortable? What presses your buttons? Where do you really feel it works for you? And I think I found in all of that I wanted to find a different path. I wanted a little bit more freedom in some ways.
And where did you go looking for freedom next?
So initially I went back to FFI, Fauna Flora International, went into a role within their leadership team, which then was great because it was, lots of strategy in that, lots of organizational stuff. And in fact, that's the other interesting thing, which I'm sure you've found, is your career develops and you grow and you do find yourself no longer being the one on the front lines. I've always stayed interested in the technical, but I got really interested in the organizational, whether it was the people in the teams or whether it was how organizations work. And so then you find yourself moving into organizational roles, whether it's strategy or fundraising.
And was this the first time that you'd had a sort of formalized leadership role with a team?
So when I started at FFI, I had a small team, and then I moved to WCMC, and then I had a team which I grew, and then I moved into the leadership team at WCMC. So I was then overseeing half the organization, and then I moved into the leadership team at FFI. And there were 5 of us, I think. And so my part of that was the regional teams that ran about, and I had a counterpart who did more of the cross-cutting stuff, and then you're sitting next to the COO and the da-da-da-da. But when you sit at that team, your first responsibility in many ways is to the organization and to that team and those players and how you bring what your part of the organization is doing to make that organization the best it could be. And it's that balance then of also looking into the piece that you're responsible for and making sure that that's working. And there's a tension there, I think, but an interesting one. And as I again, I think probably like a few people, you get into those roles and you think this is great. You're sitting around that table and you're part of a leadership team, but there's still somebody else in charge. And you're working with a board, and that was fascinating, working with boards. I loved all of that. But there's still somebody else in charge.
So I've often described it that in sort of more junior roles, there's a 2 dimension to your work. It can be like a wonderful photograph, right? An absolute image that's beautiful. Lots of Joshes on the wall there. As soon as you step up a level, that starts to gain more texture.
Yes.
And almost then it's got brushstrokes. And then once you're leading an organization, it is technical, a 3D live living, the relationships, the managing up, out, down, every which way. Sounds like you, as you went through your career, you enjoyed that levels of complexity.
Very much. Yeah, absolutely loved it. And I loved getting, I'm sort of fascinated by how the communications worked or how HR worked. And that may sound odd in some ways, when my career was all about working out how elephants worked or rhinos or Komodo dragons or systems.
But it was the same expression of a curiosity.
Yeah.
It was a curiosity in understanding how things worked. And for anyone who's ever written a literature review in this sort of old sense of the word, you'd read a paper, you'd look at the literature review of that paper, the list of references, and you'd spread out through those,
Yes.
then out the next one. And that's what you've done with concepts and ideas in businesses. And I remember every level up an organization I went, I loved the additional complexity and I adored the access to more information.
Yes. But that's a double-edged sword. So in one of those roles, I did, I got a coach and I started to do some, kind of leadership stuff and team strength stuff and figuring out, I still hadn't quite worked out what I was good at. And
have you figured that out now?
Well, what I did do was, amongst these various things was one exercise around, and I can't remember which one it was, but you answer a bunch of questions and then it tells you what your top 5 strengths are.
Strengths Finder or Myers-Briggs or something.
Yeah, the Strengths Finder one, I think.
Yeah.
And of course, you look at it, you go, "Oh my God, how did this computer program know me so well?" Of course, because you've the one who's answered the questions, but it translates it in a way that you perhaps don't see yourself when you're thinking about who you are and what you're good at. And it did throw up things like absorbed by learning new things and getting into the detail behind it, which is really useful if you want to take a role that's multifaceted and beyond your core competency. But the flip side is you get completely stuck in the detail. You go down rabbit holes. I can get obsessed by something, and of course, the more senior you get in an organization, you've got to be able to make decisions quickly and on partial information. And I'm still my own worst enemy at that because I still love the detail, but I can use the detail as some form of prevarication in many ways. Not to step out, go right enough. Now, what are you going to do about it?
As you were progressing through your career and becoming more curious about the workings of the business, when did the importance of being proactive and mindful about relationships kick in for you?
That's a really good question. I think there was a point when I went from FFI to WCMC where I was inheriting a team. When I started FFI, in many ways, it was a small group. It was a new team. We got started from scratch. We were learning together. Suddenly I was being parachuted in as a new team leader to an existing team. And at that point, it's really important, to make sure that you build a foundation quickly with those people and figure out how they work and figure out how to listen, I think. And I think that's one of the things, I had 10 days overlap with the chap who I was taking over from, and he gave me all the induction on the systems and the this and that and the other and how it worked and a brief on everybody. But ultimately it then came down to listening and watching and learning and figuring a bit about how people work, as well as demonstrating what you can do in a way that gives people confidence. So for me, it's not been about coming and going, right, this is it, new sheet, we're going to do it this way. It's much more about, okay, I'm learning as much as you are here. And so experiences of then helping people to navigate their own careers, I found really fascinating and really rewarding in a way that, again, I didn't expect to. So when you see people coming up against something, or you can see something in someone, but they haven't found the opportunity to do something with that, and then seeing what happens when you unlock something.
It sounds a fascinating transition from PhD, which is inherently quite a selfish thing because you're obsessed about your research, focused in terms of what you're doing. You saying you wanted to be with the animals as far away from people as possible, to then being driven by helping others and being around others. And certainly it sounds like your approach to leadership was very much a being in service of the team. That's quite a transition.
And I think part of it was because I was going into an organisation that was focused in something I knew really, in many ways, very little about in terms of its context, which was the international policy realm, the UN system. You're dealing with people who are running projects every day. The business model of that organisation was much more like a consultancy, in that they did product and services for the UN, for governments, for other partners. And so you had people who were project managers who were delivering, who were technically very good and who had their networks. And I had to come in and learn all of that. So almost, I had no choice but to let them roll with it and then sort of pick it up as I could go. But we grew that team in the 5 years I was there. That team trebled in size and in terms of the scope of what we were doing, which I don't put down to me going out there and, killing the buffalo. It was much more about, I think, how opportunities emerged, and I helped and let people, grow with those, as well as grabbing a few along the way. And what you realize quickly is you achieve far more through other people and through a team. As you become a team leader, it's not about the papers you write or the presentations you do or the funding you win. It's actually about, how all those people themselves deliver things, individually and collectively. And I suppose that was a transition point in many ways, which then took me into leading bigger teams and leading organizations.
I think it's something I've realized through speaking to a lot of amazing leaders through this process of the podcast. The leadership role models when I was a kid were the 80s action heroes, the don't say anything, hit first, ask questions later, be like the outlaw, the Rambos, the Rocket, like Sylvester Stallone also type leadership role models. What a terrible way to tell people that that's how you lead. It wasn't until I came out of PhD, which again, very competitive, very adversarial. It was sport that certainly taught me the value in you succeed by elevating others, not by pushing them back. And I think that's lovely now for the environment sector, especially. I think we're out of that period, and we are definitely in that time of collaboration and support. And that toxic masculinity is gone, I think, from where it was.
It's varied, isn't it? You look across, we've all, I'm sure you have, we've all had bosses who we really respect. We've all had bosses who are, toxic in various ways. Yeah, it's sort of the nature of it. But I kind of think and hope it's changing. I think, the experiences we're all having are very different to those of the generation that preceded us. But I think one of my bosses I probably respect the most on face value would seem like quite an alpha male in many ways. And yet, in reality, is incredibly astute, I think, about people and about sort of trusting people and giving people space. And I'm not going to name him, but one of my earlier experiences with him was when he actually bawled me out in a crowded office, because I was a junior. He wasn't my boss at the time, but some decision which we'd taken around where funding was going internally, and he was very cross that his particular thing wasn't gonna be funded, and he got very cross in the office, and he dabbed and he stormed out, and within about 15 seconds he walked back in and apologized, and that was the point at which I thought, okay, this guy's got it. This guy's worth listening to, because he didn't just throw his toys out the cot. He reeled it back in, and actually, subsequently, I've worked with him several times, and it's always been great fun.
Two things jumped out when you said that. One was who I will name this gentleman. One of, if not the best boss I'd ever worked with, a guy called Dave Sheldon when I was at the Environment Agency. He was the youngest major in the British Territorial Army, and you would assume very like traditional male leadership model, but just incredibly empathetic, self-aware, caring, incredible leader. So shout out to Dave. Appreciate you hugely. The other one I think is the power of being willing to say, I'm sorry, I was wrong, and being open to those things.
Yes.
So transformative in a leadership perspective, because for too often people have assumed you should have all the answers and you should know everything. I think my rule about recruitment is only hire people better than you and ask them what to do. Yeah. And that is just, we have process. So when we started OC a little over 3 years ago, every word that was written was mine. Every photo that was taken was mine. So I was working in the business. We've now just done an amazing additional acquisition I did not write a word of the proposal document. I didn't take the photography. I oversaw people who, over the last year, each section is now written by someone far better than I could ever be at that section. And the whole business is better as a result. I think when I started my career, the leadership view was, oh God, we can't recruit someone who might be better than us because they'll take our position, as opposed to recognizing the elevation of the whole piece.
Yeah. And that's it. And again, the more you get into organizations, and the more you end up with bigger and more diverse portfolios, the more you can't know. You can't know everything. You've got to trust people. But, part of that is also about making the right kind of hire, which I know you focus very hard on. Partly it's about understanding what people are really good at. Because again, I think, it's very easy, isn't it, in an organization to create a structure and to go, okay, this is the structure and these are the boxes and therefore we need this kind of people. And, the rules for any team is it's about the individuals in the team, not the boxes they're sitting in. And part of, I think, leadership is about understanding, the shape and size of your team and those individuals to get the most out of them. Because the minute you start going, they don't quite fit the box, and you start pushing against that, you could get into trouble, I think.
I completely agree. We should all try as leaders to give your people the opportunity to spend more time doing the things they're great at, as opposed to the things they're not.
Yeah.
Biggest team you've ever managed?
So at FFI, there were 300 odd, I think, worldwide. I mean, my team was 4, and they were the regional directors, and they had their teams and country offices. So that was a big chunk. More directly, I suppose, WCMC there were 18 in my program. But at the time we finished, I think that was it about a dozen nationalities? I think it was great. I mean, because we were not the UN, but we were very associated with the UN, and it meant we could hire quite freely. And it was very much in an international feel in that organisation, which was brilliant. And now at Cornwall Wildlife Trust, we're around about 100, 115, I think.
I mean, that's a big team still.
It is, yeah.
So take us to arriving at Cornwall Wildlife Trust. How did we end up there?
Yeah, gosh. Well, lockdown changed a lot, didn't it? My career's been international. It's been all over, most continents. All the stuff we've talked about. I had begun to get interested in what was happening in the UK for a little while. So because I was traveling a lot, I wanted to do something on my own back doorstep. I got involved with Wildlife Trust up in Cambridgeshire, Bedfordshire, Northamptonshire. So I became a trustee and did that for about 10 years. And that was
and family situation at this point?
Yeah, up in Cambridge.
Yeah. So
by then, kids and I was still traveling a lot, but based in the UK and traveling and then coming back again.
Yeah.
So okay, well, it'd be worth getting involved. And I met Brian, the chief exec there, at an event, and he's deeply impressive. And so like you were saying about talking to people and making chances, I just went up to him afterwards and said, I want to come and do something with you. I think you're great. And this is me. Anyway, I ended up getting onto one of the committees and then becoming a trustee for a while. So
I think you overplay how lucky you've been. And I think you underplay.
If I look at my career, I've been really lucky.
Really. I think really, you've made the chances. I think everything you've described is you turning up, you go in the extra mile, you think about the opportunity to do stuff. That's when you've
not premeditated though, I think.
But the premeditated bit is the trying to do more, trying to explore more, trying to help people, just trying to get involved. That bit is.
Yes, maybe. And then I think maybe the people bit about, just, being more energized by people and interactions than I'd given myself credit for.
But even being open to that's really cool, because some people think, I'm not going to like this, and just refuse to be open to it, but going, well, maybe I will try that. Maybe I'll try that variety.
And actually, that's a good point, because I grew up down in Cornwall by the sea in a quite wild landscape, and lived in Cambridge, around Cambridge for a long time.
Different.
Very different. You're a long way from the sea. It's very flat. It's very transformed, and it's not my place. So there was a little bit of me that had to work a bit to get enthusiastic about it. But the reason I did it was because it was on my doorstep, it was local, and I thought, I should, and then there might be something in this, and then you get to understand a bit about how the UK conservation scene works, and about how charities in the UK work, how the Wildlife Trust work, and you're sitting on a board when you are reporting to boards, it's a great thing to do.
Totally,
because you understand the other side of it. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah.
But at the same time, and part of the reason that I did that was because when I was at WCMC, one of the things that we did was a thing called the UK National Ecosystem Assessment, which was basically a big study of the value of nature to society in the UK. And this came out of, I guess through the sort of beginnings of my career, environmental economics was becoming, more of a thing. People were beginning to think about integrated conservation and development, the role of nature and these kind of things. That then morphed into thinking about ecosystem services, that concept, and the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which was a global assessment to look at what was happening to ecosystems and therefore what was happening to, to the benefits and flows we get from nature to society. That became sort of married with a very economic analytical approach to then start to put some numbers on it. And the UK government back in the sort of mid-2000s had seen the global assessment, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and said, we should do something like that in the UK and really try and understand, what nature's giving us. And WCMC, we basically got the contract to do that. In fact, I think it started before my time, but in the end, it landed on my desk. I wrote the pitch. We built the team. We worked with about 500 scientists across the UK, the 4 devolved administrations, 2-year study, and it crossed from the Labour government to the coalition. We all thought a year in, they're going to cut the budget, new government, they're going to kill this. And they didn't, to their credit. So there's this huge study looking at 8 or 10 different kinds of ecosystem and all the gamut of ecosystem services, and also looked at a whole bunch of future policy scenarios of, okay, what might the future look like, and what would that do to the value we're getting out of nature? And of course, there are some really nice ones there around nature working for us, and integrated farming, and this. And then there were some really tough ones, which were, nationalism, turning inwards, climate change affecting things, fuel crisis, all the stuff that's kind of happening. It's kind of the worst case one in many ways, but it was a big piece of work that I think in many ways changed the narrative in the UK, because when it was done, the government released a white paper on the environment. It was the first one they'd done for many, many, many years, and put funding into things called nature improvement areas, which was the first government funding that went into sort of nature restoration, recovery, management for public good in some ways. And out of that came the Natural Capital Committee, and out of that, of course, then came the sort of public money for public goods and everything we've seen that's come in sort of later years. So that move from an academic consideration of the value of nature into real policy considerations, incentives, I think, although that piece of work itself wasn't, plastered across the papers and wasn't, a huge sort of, publicly visible thing, I think it's taken us into a place that now is very different to when I started.
Well, and it's analogous of your career.
Yeah.
With the PhDs,
exactly.
the chapters, the policies, into the application, into moving finally to operational in Cornwall.
Yeah. So I'd done that piece of work, which was UK folks, started to meet a bunch of people in the UK, starting to do this work with the Wildlife Trust up around Cambridgeshire. Then the pandemic hit, and all of us will suddenly found ourselves in front of screens, didn't we, at home? But all of us who were working internationally suddenly weren't working internationally. And I went slightly crazy, I'll be honest with you. I struggled really.
What was your travel regime before that? How often were you away and how did you travel?
I was traveling, I would be traveling probably a week a month, I suppose. But it was never a week a month. It would be like 2 weeks every 6 or 7, and then whatever. But it was all over the place. I was traveling a fair bit. It's international, so it's airports. I didn't ever enjoy the actual travel, but I loved the destinations and all that side of things. But suddenly we were thrust into 24/7 at home in front of a screen, and it was tough anyway because we had teams all over the world when lockdown hit. We had people out of context, not where they were meant to be, and stuck for months away from that. We had different countries with different regimes of lockdown. So there was a huge kind of effort around health and safety, around keeping in touch with people. And you're doing that from, sort of 5, 6 in the morning, you're talking to Asia, and at 10 at night, you're talking to Central America. And on one level, that was great, kicked into gear. But once that kind of adrenaline piece sort of ebbed, suddenly it was, okay, is this a new reality? Is this how it's going to be? And for better or worse, it just didn't work for me. And I began to realize then that I was thinking more about my own footprint. That was a thing. Whether or not that was lockdown stimulated, whether that was Greta Thunberg stimulated, or whether it was whatever it was, you're starting to think, well, I've stopped flying, and actually I'm quite happy about that. Do I want to go back to it? Don't know. Anyway, a whole bunch of things sort of happened in that period, and I started then to actively look for UK jobs. And prior to that, if anybody said to me, Matt, what's your dream job? You have all this stuff, what's your dream job? I would always say Cornwall or Dartmoor. I'd love to go and run Dartmoor National Park. I'd love to go and work in Cornwall, do something there. It's always a complete pipe dream. Everybody sort of laugh or go, oh, that's interesting. Because, there was no obvious pathway to that whatsoever. And yet here we are. And I think, again, you can call it luck, call it whatever you like, but Carolyn, my predecessor, who'd been there 4 years, was headhunted into another role, and so they advertised Cornwall. And at that point, what do I do? So in fact, at the time, funnily enough, at the time I was working with WWF International, and again, it was a global role. It was brilliant because of lockdown, because it brought all of the leadership worldwide together in a way that pre-lockdown we would never have done. I'd never have got access to the senior folk in WWF that I got during that period in lockdown, because everybody was very used to being on Zoom all the time. So, I was involved, it was a very minor role, but involved in helping them think about the 30 by 30 target and what it meant for the network and how they approached that. And this was in the run up to the last biodiversity COT. And they could get 300 leaders across that network of 8,000 people, on a set of calls and things very, very easily. So it was fabulous in that sense, but it was all done sitting at home in a spare room. And I did have a chance to sort of progress that and stay longer with WWF. But then when Cornwall came up, and they saw fit to offer me the job, it was a no-brainer.
Amazing. Absolutely. So how long there now?
Just over 2 years.
Just over 2 years. When you think back from when you started to now, what are the key moments, the key high spots that you think, I'm super, super proud we did that and we've achieved that?
In terms of the Cornwall job,
Absolutely.
What we've done there? Yeah. It's been such a whirlwind. It's been incredible. When I started, the organisation was in a transition. There's no doubt. Carolyn had started that from, in terms of a process of modernisation, I guess, around governance and around processes and systems and structures. But the organisation fundamentally was in a very strong place. It'd been well managed. They had resources, and so there was a lot, to start with. But Carolyn had left, and their director of finance then left, and then I think the director of funding and communication left, and so suddenly we had a really fragmented leadership team. So I came in, and my director of finance and resources started a week before me, and I had a couple of very long-standing members of the team and a couple of sort of acting up members of the team. So the first thing I had to do was, okay, we got to make something of this team, because everybody's looking around going, right, what now? And I think possibly one of the things that I'm happiest about for sure is how that team has come together over the last couple of years, because within all of that process, we've developed a new strategy, which we launched 6 or 8 months ago. We've gone through a whole process of redefining the organization's values. We've done a certain amount of restructuring and investment in key things. We've nudged a whole bunch of stuff forward, but at the heart of it is a team of very different and diverse individuals who have found themselves in a situation, come together and said, okay, let's do this. Let's do something. And they're a great bunch. They're a real great bunch.
So talk to us about the strategy and the objectives for the trust. So you recently launched the new strategy?
Yeah, we did. Yep. So we're part of a federation of 46 wildlife trusts, and the umbrella body, we all sort of collectively contribute to a national strategy, but we're all individual organizations. We're all separate legal entities with our own board and everything else. So within that sort of framework, we're each slightly different in terms of what we focus on, things we do. when I came in, they just were coming to the end of a strategy cycle and were looking to refresh. And so that was kind of my
Nice time.
API for my first 6 months was, lead the strategy process, which was great. They'd done a huge amount of legwork with members, with staff, and everybody else. So there was a lot of data there already and a lot of sense of things. And in fact, Carolyn, when just before she left, they had a staff meeting. She got all the staff in groups around the tables to write a letter to the new incoming chief exec, and they didn't know who it was at the time, with their messages of what they thought, I should do. And
what an amazing array of information.
That was absolutely genius, because then it was, okay, this is brilliant. I can see straight away what staff are seeing, not just in terms of, these are the issues you need to solve. It was more a case of, these are things we really think we should be doing. This is what we need to be focusing on. And, wildlife trusts started life, most of them, if not all of them, as custodians of nature reserves of some description. A group of very passionate local naturalists who got together and managed to purchase or acquire pieces of land and do nature conservation. And that's still there as a foundation. We've got 59 or 60, I think. And for a lot of people, a lot of our members, that's the heart of what we are and what we do. But the strategy is not about that. The strategy is all based on the analysis of what's happening and what are we going to do about that. So, think about it. Nature. The curve is doing that. And the whole narrative is, how do we bend that curve? How do we get to a place of nature recovery? And we can't do that on our own. We can't. So therefore, what is our lever? What can we do? We can either say, let's just do it to the best of our ability on our own land. Okay. Or maybe let's expand, let's acquire more land. And some trusts are doing that. And we all, to a certain extent, do, but it's still a tiny fraction of Cornwall. And we start to talk about 30 by 30 in terms of an overall target for the county, the country, the movement, internationally. 30% of land and sea well managed for nature. We will never do that on our own. So the question is, are we happy just to do our bit, or can we do more than that? And as a trust, of course, we have a membership base, we have an audience, we have relationships with neighbours, with decision makers, with companies. So our focus has become very much on other people and how we get them to meaningfully take action for nature. So our strategy is now based around sort of 4 ways of doing that. We can do that through education and inspiration and demonstration from our own work. So then that changes a little bit how we think about our nature reserves. It's not just, are they performing well for this species or for that habitat, but are we telling the stories? Are people learning from that? Are we doing things that other people could take up? And are we giving them the opportunity to see that and be inspired by it? So that's part of it. The next is, how do we use our knowledge and our experience to support and advise others to do it themselves? And that is in large part is landowners, other landowners. In Cornwall, like so much of the country, 3/4 of the land is farmed. So that takes you into, okay, how do we work with land managers, landowners, farmers to effectively create space, more space for nature in interconnected networks if we can. But it's also working with marine industries, fishers. So the marine side of things in Cornwall is obviously huge. We've got that incredible coastline, got that incredible marine life. And when you look at all our socials, it's the picture of the whales and the dolphins that people really respond to, and it's phenomenal. So it's working with not just those who are responsible for what's happening on land, but those who influence what's happening around our coastlines. It's then beyond that, how do we mobilize a tribe? How do we get the wider public taking action in their own lives in whatever way that may be? And as a charity, as a trust, we've worked a lot with community groups, again, a lot around the coast, but also other kinds, helping people to do what they want to do in their own spaces, which is really, really key. And then the last part of that is, how do we then use our voice? Because as a, fairly traditional wildlife charity, we're not Surfers Against Sewage. We're not a campaigning group. We're not lobbyists. We're naturalists, and we have our nice little reserves. But the murmur has been for a while, is that enough? And as with Craig Bennett arriving nationally, that's taken that conversation further. But even within Cornwall, we said, okay, look, we could do more, and we could get more of our members, more of the public doing more. And there was an interesting experiment around that, because I arrived, I think, 3 or 4 days before Liz Truss. In terms of her new role, I've lasted a little longer. And when that administration came in, there was a lot of concern about decisions they were taking that were going to influence, incentives for nature, regulations around nature, a whole bunch of things. And so a lot of organisations, charities jumped up down and started talking about an attack on nature and what we do about it. And we said, okay, what do we do with this? And we joined in, and we wrote to our members, and we got a bit of stuff going. And we had some people saying, this is not why I'm a member of this trust. This is not what you should be doing. This is political. You shouldn't be political. You should be just looking after your nature reserves. And I wrote back to those people and basically said, understand where you're coming from, but please understand that we are, as a charity, we are by definition political, not party political, but we have a mission, we have a charitable objective, and our role as a charity is to defend and support that. And part of that is about speaking out in favour of it. So this is not about a particular political party. It's not about a particular politician. It's about a set of decisions and policies that are affecting nature in Cornwall. And if we don't shout about it, then we're not really doing our job as part of this broader suite. And what normally happens when you do that is people go, oh, okay, yeah, okay, we can see that now. So we've had quite a good response to it. And again, we're still playing with this. We're still experimenting with it.
I love the way you describe the traditional role and composition of a trust, the impact of Craig, which has been more campaign orientated, has been braver, in terms of bolder, perhaps. And Craig's due in at some point, which would be awesome. I'd love to have him on. It's something I talk a lot about, certainly when I'm speaking to the finance sector, is we need to understand the origin of trust, the wildlife, the woodland, the rivers trust. And they're amazing at what they're here to do. But what they're not here to do is to be the vehicle of change to commercialize and commoditize the environment. It's not what they're there for. And I think there's a belief for some that money will flow into the environment sector from private institutions, and suddenly all the wildlife trusts and rivers trusts will mobilize and start delivering them their units of natural capital that they want. And I explain, viewed through that prism, the performance, culture and standards expected by financial institutions and regulated services are not the same. They're a different language, the scale of investment. So go back 5 years, a £50,000 project in the environment sector was a press release and an amazing thing. Yeah. To a pension fund, 50 million doesn't move the needle. So it's a different language, it's a different purview. So when I'll talk about the performance standard in a commercial sense being very different, it's not intended to be critical of the environment sector, because I've served on boards of Wildlife Trust and had an amazing time with Harry and the team in Devon, and worked with you and others who are doing incredible things. But we can't expect people to be who they're not. We need the trust to do what they do, which is brilliant on the ground delivery, working with people, gently influencing, encouraging, and as you say, playing on the margins of what that is. Yeah. And let businesses like us and Rebalance Earth and Restore and Highlandshire Wilding and Nattergal will do that. We'll get out front, we'll take the flak, and together we'll...
Yeah, in terms of scale. So obviously, all wildlife trusts, we're the same, have land holdings, have a portfolio. We've got to figure out ways of funding that, and particularly when you start to acquire things that need more active restoration, or then we're not always getting a nice pristine bit of habitat and just making sure it's okay.
Yep.
It's increasingly becoming, how do we return these things, whether it's through principles of rewilding or other forms of whatever. And there are private revenue flows, private sector revenue flows that can deliver on that, as you know.
Yep.
But you are right. From where I'm sitting, we've got 5,500 acres. Yeah. Our target for 2030 is 50,000, but it's not 50,000 acres that we own and manage and do the kind of stuff you're doing. It's basically, we want to influence 10 times as much land as we control through all of that support, advisory, influencing work. And we've got people who can do that. Yep. And we've got connections to do that. And increasingly, we're building these concepts of interconnected nature recovery areas that go from our reserves, often like at the top of the water catchment, down into the bay, taking in all the other landowners in between and the communities and the businesses that are there. And as a charity, as a membership charity, we're really movement builders.
Totally. That membership bit's so important because, you have to represent, speak to, listen to such a broad church.
Yeah.
I can sit in the same room with my investor base and my team and make a decision to work at that pace. And we can say, yeah, we might get criticized for this, we might get celebrated for that, but I think we have a greater bandwidth to be freer and faster in relation to that. But we need everyone doing their bit, from the people who are monitoring and verifying things to the data scientists to the ecologists through to the trust and the charities and the private business. That's one of my rules is we will only ever up-talk everyone in the sector about the bit they do wonderfully well, because we need to grow the whole thing. We need to grow the whole natural capital economy.
And there is no one model. There's no one way of doing things. This is never going to be, okay, we're going to, ditch national parks, we're going to ditch wildlife trusts, we're going to ditch whatever, we're going to do something else. There are going to be new ways of doing things. And even within, long-standing charities like ours, you can bring in innovation, new ways of doing things. And that's one of the really exciting, again, this is crazy. When I think about, the things and that I've done, the places I've gone, and the kind of what people would traditionally think is, you've gone, well, that's cool. How cool are pigs? I mean, it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. And I've been quite surprised at how passionate people get about pigs, but also just seeing what a pig can do, to a bit of scrub, a bit of bracken is absolutely amazing. And it's what I found really fascinating coming back to Cornwall, coming back to do this in the UK is we're lucky in Cornwall. It's wild. It's really wild in places. For all its transformation, you've still got that sense of, okay, this is another country. It feels when you're up on the moors, you're on the cliffs, and we've got things like beavers coming back. That kind of stuff happening. And when you talk about rewilding, it's very tempting to think, okay, that's this is it. We want to have beavers and storks and elk and whatever else. Great, but using the pigs, using the cows, doing that kind of stuff. And starting to see the change that's happening. You can bring people into that. People are not suspicious of pigs in the way they can be of beavers.
Yeah. So I'm super excited about how a new podcast producer is going to make a clip of you being like, pigs are great. Just make that as being the absolute thing. Beautiful. It's about storytelling with that, though, isn't it?
Yes.
And about giving people hope and optimism and excitement and cuteness and triggering those emotional things that excite people in that. How much do you think about that in terms of your communication as the trust?
Oh, very much, very much. So we, in fact, yesterday we were all sitting down with a consultant that was helping us think about fundraising, particularly in the context of more major gift fundraising, and the important things you need to have in place. And one of them is to have those amazing stories, but also those amazing experiences. And what we find is, our best storytellers are the folk who are out there on the front line day in, day out. And you take a group of members or a group of politicians or a team from a business, and you get them out in wellies or on a kayak, with those folk. It blows them away. When we did our most recent AGM, we've gone back to doing in-person AGMs after all of that.
And are they better?
Yes. I mean, we with the online things, you might get 40, 50, 60 of the. I mean, AGMs tend to bring in the diehards. There's a demographic that will go to AGMs, and a lot of your members just not that interested. So it's always going to be a bit of a hardcore. And it's tempting to say, well, the AGM is it's a formality, so let's do it online on a Thursday evening, 45 minutes, tick the boxes, vote in the new trustees, game over, done. But I think you lose an opportunity to engage if you do that. So last year we did an in-person one that was just the AGM and a talk, and that was okay. And this year we said, no, let's go back to where we used to be. Let's do a full-on members day. So we said, right, come down, we're going to do a walk, tour on the moor in the reserve, see where the beavers are. And then we'll do the AGM, we'll have a couple of slideshows and things. 200 people, it's like just like that. In fact, no, it was more than that. We ended up having to do another day's walk on another day because my team, felt guilty about all the people who wanted to come and couldn't.
That's lovely.
Which is great. But in that, we did then the AGM, and we had a couple of talks, and one was on all the marine mammals because again, it's iconic, and people can really get into that, and it speaks to that sense of pride in many ways. that sense of place and connection in Cornwall, which is so very strong in Cornwall.
Yeah.
So the other one we did was a story. It was a 20-year history of one of our reserves, which we got as a farm and which we've slowly started to restore and recover. And Callum, who heads up our nature recovery team, our reserves teams, did this wonderful talk where he just talked about what it was like we started and all the different things they've done and the things they learned and the odd things that happened where, it wasn't necessarily planned, but you discovered that a particular, and don't ask me the details, particular plant likes to grow where cattle has poached the ground and will come up. So they happen to drive a tractor through in a muddy thing and it scuffs up and there's a wee big tractor marks and of course all these things started growing. It's like, oh my God, look at that. They put in ponds and then these extraordinarily rare dragonflies started appearing. And you grab people with those stories. You don't have to be a taxonomist, or a fanatical birder. I'm not a birder. I'm not really a naturalist. I didn't start doing this because as a kid I was, rootling around, with bugs or bird watching or anything. But there's, the stories of how a place can change and enrich through the little things you do and the mistakes you make, the things you learn along the way. Those are the captivating stories. And we've got to tell those. For all the graphs, which are brilliant, we've got to tell those stories.
Completely agree. Did you send your team on a scavenger hunt looking for you recently?
Yeah, that was this week. So that was interesting. We started, when I started, we did a few things to get the team together. And we started with some offsites around strategy and this and the other, because that was our time to, away from the operational to think it all through. Great. And they always tended to be, well, we hire a village hall or somewhere and do something. It wasn't very exotic, but it did what it needed to do. And then the last one we did that for half day and then we went out kayaking on the river and that was a bit nicer. And this one, we wanted to do something that was a bit more around us as a team and some thinking about team building. And in fact, in advance, I got them all to do one of these team strength surveys, which we did end up talking about. But I was thinking, what can we do as a team that, and I thought, we should do an escape room. Let's do an escape room. That would be great, wouldn't it? So I said to them a couple of weeks ago, I said, anybody ever done an escape room? And two of them went, oh, it's my worst nightmare. That I couldn't possibly do it. It's far too claustrophobic, And I'm going, oh, right, okay. I'm glad I haven't booked that. What can we do instead? And I thought, why don't we do an open air escape room instead? So I don't know. Sometimes you just, I find myself sometimes going off on a weird tangent. So I ended up saying, right, didn't tell them, I'm going to do a kind of like a treasure hunt stroke, thing. So it was basically I can go into a lot of detail about this if you like. They showed up at one of our satellite offices where I said, be there 9:15. And I wasn't there. But when they got in the door, there was a puzzle box with a combination and a car key for the office car. And then when they got to the car, there was some instructions. And basically what I ended up doing was giving them a set of puzzles and clues, which then sort of gave them 3 words locations. And they then ended up having to navigate to 4 of our reserves. So they slowly figured out what was going on. But in visiting those reserves, actually, there were places they hadn't all been to. We had a conversation about those reserves and around people and stuff. But where it ended up was all the clues came together to unlock the combination. And once they'd unlocked the combination, that was then the, table 5 at Cafe X for lunch. So it was. I
adore it.
I really enjoyed doing it. It meant I didn't spend any of the morning with them. I should go do something else.
I don't think that's you saying that's what you enjoy.
I enjoyed the setup and thinking about the dead drop and the this and the how you do it. When I tested it, so I put it all together, I made sure it worked, and then I tested it with a few people, and I suddenly thought, oh my God, this is too difficult. They don't get these clues. They're not going to be able to do it. I've how when you design a puzzle and you know the answers, it's obvious to you, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, they're not going to get it. They're not going to be able to do it. They completely nailed it. And I think that's partly because it was a team of them working together off it. They figured a few things out early on. And I know they really enjoyed it as well.
Mate, I adore that. It's such a lovely thing to do. And so few people in leadership roles care. I don't mean care as in worry their team are well and happy and fed and watered. That's your bare minimum. But I mean care to enhance and to create excitement and interest and enrichment. And that is top quality leadership. You should be really proud of it.
Well, thanks for saying that. I mean, I think part of it for me was challenging myself, see if I could do it and do something that would work.
But
and
again,
be fun.
You did it in service of someone else, though.
Yes, yeah.
And that's clearly so important to you throughout your career as being, perhaps not early on, it was in service of wildlife more than it was people. But there's been chapters that you brought us through where clearly helping others have that excitement and that experience was a big thing.
And, and I think, because a strong team needs to be a team that trusts each other, that's able to be open and honest, hold each other to account, all those things, as well as collectively focusing on the results. And a lot of that starts with, a certain amount of stuff about, being and working together and stuff that's not the thorny office stuff. And and we did wrap it back to that. So at the end, we sat down and looked at the spider graph of how we had collectively or individually each, answered questions that told us whether we were good at certain aspects of a high performing team. Yeah. And it told us a lot about what we know, which was we think we are a pretty good team. We think we do have, we certainly have that sense of togetherness on it, and a recognition of what we each bring, and an ability to say what we think, even if what we think might be different to what somebody else thinks, and then to wrap that back into taking a decision.
Love it.
Yeah.
What are you excited about the future, both professionally and personally?
So having put this strategy in place, having built a bunch of foundations in the organisation, and the most recent one being the values piece we did, which turned into something quite a lot more fundamental than I thought it was going to be. It's one of those things where we went through the strategy and then we went, oh my God, we haven't written down any values. What are we going to do? And then it became who are we? And again, all the staff got involved in that. We brought somebody in to help us think about it, and we've got something we think is us, and really, is something we can all say, this is who we are, and this is how we define ourselves, and this is how we want to be. Brilliant, absolutely love all of that. But having got all that in place, we've now got 5, 6 years to 2030, and we've got some big ambitions in that strategy. So we've got to now get out there and really start to deliver that. And what I'm excited about, I guess, is seeing how we do that, how the organisation gets together to do that. And we've got a lot of the foundations, because none of it is stuff we don't already do, but it's ramping up a gear, or it's trying it in a new way. It's creating that bigger sense of scope and ambition. And one of the things that you probably know about is our Tortoise Shore project, which is a large landscape seascape restoration or nature recovery initiative built around some of the reserves and the key habitats that we manage or care about, but very much bringing in the wider community and the wider landowners as a model. It's something we want to use and apply elsewhere. So we've started that process, things like the rewilding of the area around Halman Tor with the pigs. We're now seeing the beavers come back in. That project is now beginning to roll. But again, that in itself won't be enough. We've got the rainforest stuff to do. We've got much more marine stuff to do. We've got other things going on. And I've got all of the teams to put together delivery plans. So underneath that strategy is, okay, well, for each of those bits and for each of those ambitions, whether it's 50,000 acres or 100,000 people doing whatever, how are we going to get there? What's that going to look like? So now we're starting to see that, and what are the big pieces there? The next step is, right now we're going to have to start to package this in projects that are sellable. Because we can only do so much of this with our membership base, and when things come in, we've actually got to scale our resources around this. And there's a really interesting journey in that as well, about how we do that. But again, building on some great stuff, but also thinking outside the box in terms of the kind of resources that are out there. And so I think, what am I excited about? I'm excited about all of it, really. I'm excited about to see where it goes from here.
Mate, I'm excited that you're in the sector. Thank you so much for coming in. The Cornwall, the Southwest, the environment sector in general is blessed to have you in it. You're an absolute star.
You're very kind. I'm certainly enjoying it, and it is the best job I've ever had.
Perfect. Thanks, guys.